Snow lashed against the jagged peaks of Blackwood Mountain, burying the scent of the woman who held the kingdom's future. Silas Montgomery, the most feared alpha in North America, fell to his knees in the frost. He had finally found her, but the whimpers echoing in the dark changed everything. The nightmare began on the evening of December 18th, during the annual Montgomery Foundation Gala. To the human politicians and corporate elites of Denver, Silas Montgomery was a ruthless billionaire real estate mogul. To the sprawling, hidden society of the lycanthrope world, he was the Alpha King. His territory stretched from the biting cold of the Canadian border down to the sun-baked plains of Texas. Yet, for all his terrifying power, Silas was completely anchored by one woman, Vivian Hayes. Vivian was not born to royalty. She was the daughter of a humble pack historian from a marginalized sector in Oregon. When Silas claimed her as his mate and Luna 2 years prior, the high-born werewolf families, especially the old, moneyed bloodlines of the East Coast, were scandalized. They whispered that she was too fragile, too soft to rule a kingdom built on fang and claw. But Vivian had quietly proven them wrong, ruling with an unprecedented, fierce compassion. Now, heavily pregnant with what Pack physician Dr. Arthur Sterling confirmed were triplets, Vivian was the most protected woman on earth, or so Silas thought. The gala was held at the Montgomery Central Estate, a sprawling, fortified compound nestled in the foothills of the Rockies. Champagne flowed, string quartets played, and elite security personnel, both human and werewolf, patrolled the perimeter. At 9:15 p.m., Vivian, feeling the heavy ache of her third trimester, whispered to Silas that she was going upstairs to their private wing to rest. Silas kissed her forehead, surrounded by a dozen council members, demanding his attention. That was the last time he saw her. At 10:30 p.m., Silas went upstairs. The heavy oak doors to their master suite were slightly ajar. The king's enhanced senses immediately flared, catching a metallic tang in the air, masked heavily by the scent of bleached chemicals. "Vivian?" Silas's voice was a low rumble that vibrated through the floorboards. There was no answer. The suite was empty. Her silk shawl lay abandoned on the Persian rug. The reinforced window leading out to the eastern balcony was shattered, the glass glittering on the carpet like crushed diamonds. More terrifyingly, the estate's internal communication lines were dead. Panic, raw and animalistic, erupted in Silas's chest. A deafening roar tore from his throat, shaking the very foundations of the mansion. Within seconds, his most trusted enforcers, Liam and Wyatt, burst into the room, their eyes glowing with the golden light of their inner wolves. "Lock down the estate," Silas commanded, his voice barely human, eyes shifting into a terrifying, luminous amber. "No one leaves. Not the council, not the staff, not the human guests. Ground all flights at the private strip. Bring me Beta Gideon, now." But Beta Gideon was nowhere to be found. The chaos that followed was methodical and brutal. Sheriff Brody, a human law enforcement officer on Silas's payroll, was dispatched to corral the bewildered human guests, feeding them a story about a localized gas leak. Meanwhile, the Pack's elite tracking unit scoured the grounds. It was Wyatt who found the first sickening clue. At the edge of the estate's property line, where the manicured lawns met the untamed wilderness of the Rockies, lay the bodies of 3 elite Montgomery guards. Their throats had been torn out, but not by rogues. The precision of the kills indicated trained soldiers. "Alpha," Liam murmured, his boots crunching on the snow as he approached Silas. He handed over a crushed silver cufflink. Silas recognized it instantly. It bore the crest of the Northern Coalition, a separatist faction of werewolves led by radicals who vehemently opposed Silas's rule and despised Vivian's bloodline. "They didn't just take the Luna," Liam added, his voice trembling. "Silas, you need to see the nursery wing. The communal pack nursery." Silas felt the blood drain from his face. He sprinted back to the estate, tearing through the corridors, to the secure wing where the pack's highest-ranking families kept their young children during large events. The steel doors had been blown open. The caretakers were unconscious, darted with heavy wolfsbane sedatives. 9 pups, ranging from 6 months to 2 years old, were missing. The realization hit Silas with the force of a freight train. This was not just a kidnapping. It was an act of absolute war. The Northern Coalition intended to hold the next generation of the Montgomery Pack hostage, along with the Alpha King's heavily pregnant mate, to force Silas to surrender his crown. "Get the tactical SUVs," Silas growled, his jaw clenching so hard his teeth cracked. The storm outside was worsening, a massive blizzard rolling down from the peaks, bringing temperatures that would drop to -20. Deploy every tracker. Call in the regional alphas. If they harm a single hair on Vivian's head or touch one of those pups, I will wipe their bloodlines from the face of the earth. By midnight, a massive convoy of heavily modified, snow-capable vehicles tore up the mountain roads. Silas rode in the lead SUV, his hands gripping the steering wheel until the leather tore. Beside him, Dr. Sterling sat with trauma kits, his face pale. "Silas," Dr. Sterling spoke quietly over the roar of the engine. "Vivian is 8 months along. The stress, the cold. If she goes into premature labor in this weather—" "She won't," Silas snapped, refusing to let the horrific image enter his mind. "She is stronger than they know." But deep down, the Alpha King was terrified. Vivian was gentle. She loved painting, baking, and reading in the sunroom. How could she survive a brutal winter abduction by seasoned killers? At 2 a.m., the convoy hit a dead end. An engineered avalanche had completely wiped out the mountain pass leading into the Blackwood Peaks. They could drive no further. Silas stepped out into the howling wind, the snow instantly whipping against his face. He stripped off his heavy coat, his bones already beginning to snap and reform as his massive, midnight black wolf pushed to the surface. "We track on foot," Silas roared, to the dozens of men stepping out behind him. "We don't stop until we find our Luna." The blizzard was a blinding, deafening monster. For 4 agonizing hours, Silas and his elite guard, Liam, Wyatt, and 20 other seasoned warriors, navigated the treacherous, near-vertical slopes of Blackwood Mountain. They were entirely in their wolf forms, massive beasts of muscle and fur, battling snowdrifts that reached their chests. The scent trail was maddeningly faint. The kidnappers were smart. They had used snowmobiles and masked their trail with a mixture of crushed pine and synthetic wolfsbane spray. But they underestimated a mate's bond. Silas could feel a faint, frantic tugging in his chest, a metaphysical thread connecting his soul to Vivian's. It was weak, flickering like a dying candle in a hurricane, but it was there. As the first weak, gray light of dawn began to pierce the swirling snow, the bond suddenly flared with agonizing intensity. Silas let out a sharp bark, halting the pack behind him. Up ahead, half buried in a snowbank, was a wrecked snowmobile. Silas shifted back to his human form, ignoring the biting cold against his naked skin, and pulled a pair of tactical trousers from his pack. Liam and Wyatt followed suit, weapons drawn. They cautiously approached the wreckage. Around the snowmobile lay the bodies of 4 Northern Coalition mercenaries. They hadn't died from the crash. They had been shredded. Deep claw marks gouged their tactical armor, and the snow around them was stained a deep, freezing crimson. Wyatt knelt by one of the bodies, examining the wounds. "Alpha, these aren't rogue marks. These claw patterns. They're small, precise, desperate." Silas stared at the carnage, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Vivian. She hadn't gone quietly. When the snowmobile crashed, she had fought back. His gentle, soft-spoken mate had ripped 4 trained killers to pieces to protect herself and her unborn children. "The pups," Liam said suddenly, pointing to the snow. "Look!" There were drag marks leading away from the crash site, accompanied by a single set of bare, human footprints. Vivian hadn't shifted into her wolf form to flee. She couldn't. Heavily pregnant females risked fatal complications to their unborn pups if they shifted fully. She had stayed human, dragging a heavy sled that the mercenaries had used to transport the 9 stolen pack pups. "She's dragging them up higher," Silas breathed, awe and terror warring in his voice. "She's looking for shelter. Follow the tracks. Hurry!" The footprints were quickly being erased by the falling snow. They pushed upward, the elevation making the air thin and painfully cold. The storm was worsening again, dropping the wind chill to a lethal 30 below zero. A human would freeze to death in minutes. Even a werewolf in human form would succumb to hypothermia within the hour. Silas's vision tunneled. "Hold on, Vivian. Please, hold on." Finally, nestled behind a cluster of massive, frosted boulders, Silas spotted a dark fissure in the rock face, an old, abandoned silver mine. The entrance was partially blocked by debris, but the snow around it was disturbed. Silas approached the cave entrance, his breath catching in his throat. He signaled for his men to hold back, needing to secure the area himself. As he stepped into the cavern, the howling of the wind was abruptly muffled, replaced by an eerie, heavy silence. The air inside the cave was shockingly different. While still freezing, there was a palpable, radiating wave of heat coming from the back of the cavern. It smelled of earth, copper, iron, and the unmistakable, sweet scent of newborn life. "Vivian?" Silas called out, his voice cracking, shedding all of its alpha authority, leaving only the terrified plea of a husband. From the pitch-black depths of the cave came a low, rumbling growl. It was weak, wet, and exhausted, but it carried a warning that demanded absolute respect. Silas pulled a heavy-duty flashlight from his belt and clicked it on, sweeping the beam across the stone floor. The sight before him drove the Alpha King straight to his knees. There, in the furthest corner of the cave, was Vivian. She was in a partial shift, a dangerous, excruciating state where a werewolf forces their body halfway between human and wolf to maximize body heat and physical strength without fully crushing their internal organs. Her hands were tipped with bloody claws, her eyes glowing a fierce, protective gold, and her skin was covered in a thick layer of russet fur. She was panting heavily, her breaths forming thick clouds of steam in the freezing air. But it was what she was doing that made Silas's heart stop. Vivian was curled into a massive, protective crescent, tucked tightly against her burning abdomen. Sheltered from the stone by the remnants of her shredded silk dress and Silas's own stolen hunting jacket were the 9 kidnapped pack pups. They were shivering but alive, nestled deep into her fur, and right in the center, pressed against her chest, were 3 tiny, squirming, blood-slicked bundles. She had gone into labor during the night. Alone, freezing, hunted by assassins, Vivian had delivered their triplets. "Goddess, above," Silas choked out, tears finally breaking free and freezing on his cheeks as he crawled toward her. Vivian's golden eyes snapped to him. For a split second, she bared her fangs, ready to fight to the death. Then, recognizing his scent beneath the frost, her defensive posture collapsed. She let out a whimpering, agonizing sob, her partial shift breaking as she reverted fully to her human form. The sudden loss of her wolf's endurance left her pale, trembling violently, her lips tinged blue from severe hypothermia. "Silas," she whispered, her voice barely a rasp. He stripped off his heavy thermal layers instantly, throwing his insulated jacket over her and the massive pile of children. He gathered her into his arms, pulling her freezing body against his burning chest. "I'm here, my love. I've got you. You're safe," he sobbed into her matted hair, kissing her face, her forehead, her freezing hands. "The pups?" Vivian gasped, her fingers weakly clutching his shirt. "I kept them warm, Silas. I shifted. I used my heat. They're all alive. I didn't let the cold take them." Silas looked down. 12 pups in total, 9 toddlers and infants from his pack, and 3 tiny, fragile newborns of his own blood. Vivian had drained every ounce of her own life force, burning her cellular energy to act as a living furnace for 12 children in a sub-zero blizzard all night long. "You saved them all," Silas wept, pressing his forehead to hers. "You saved our entire future." "Alpha!" Liam's voice echoed urgently from the cave entrance. He ran in, followed by Dr. Sterling, who immediately dropped his medical bags and rushed to Vivian's side. "She's severely hypothermic, and she's lost too much blood from the delivery," Dr. Sterling assessed rapidly, his hands shaking as he checked her faint pulse. "Her core temperature is dangerously low. We need to medevac her immediately, or she won't make it down the mountain." Silas's eyes hardened, the tears freezing into ice. He turned to Liam. Radio the base. Tell them to send the heavy transport choppers. I don't care about the wind. If they don't fly up here right now, I will execute every pilot on the roster. As Liam scrambled to the radio, Vivian's eyes began to flutter shut. Her grip on Silas's shirt loosened. "Vivian, stay with me," Silas commanded, pouring every ounce of his alpha energy into the mate bond, trying to force his strength into her failing body. "You did the impossible. Now you have to stay awake. Look at them. Look at our children." Vivian managed a faint, ghostly smile, her eyes drifting toward the 3 tiny newborns, who were now being wrapped in thermal foil by Wyatt and Dr. Sterling. "They're beautiful," she whispered, her voice fading into the howling wind outside. "I held the line, Silas. I held the line." And then, the Luna of the Montgomery pack went completely still in her mate's arms. The roar of the Sikorsky UH-60 Black Hawk engine was deafening. But to Silas, the world had gone entirely silent. Suspended thousands of feet above the jagged peaks of the Rockies, the heavy transport chopper battled lethal wind shear and blinding snow. Inside the stripped-down, militarized cabin, a frantic fight for life was unfolding. Vivian lay strapped to a titanium gurney, her skin the color of old parchment. The heavy, metallic scent of blood saturated the confined space, overwhelming the usual smells of aviation fuel and ozone. "Her veins are collapsing, Dr. Arthur Sterling shouted over the headset comms, his hands slick as he desperately tried to establish a second intravenous line. "The hypothermia has caused severe peripheral vasoconstriction. I can't get the warmed fluids into her system fast enough." Silas was kneeling on the vibrating metal floor, his massive hands completely enveloping Vivian's icy fingers. He was channeling every raw ounce of his alpha aura into her, trying to force his own cellular heat through the mate bond. "Take it from me," he snarled, his eyes glowing a terrifying, unstable amber. "Cut my vein. Give her a direct transfusion. Do it, Arthur. Your biology is running too hot, Alpha. If I give her unsynthesized alpha blood right now, her heart will go into shock." Dr. Sterling snapped back, ignoring protocol and rank to save his patient. He ripped open a sterile foil package, deploying a bear hugger convective warming blanket over Vivian's torso. "Pilot Jenkins, I need full military emergency clearance at Denver Memorial. If we don't touch down in exactly 14 minutes, we lose her." "Copy that, Doc." Pushing the engines to the red line, the pilot's voice crackled. Across the cabin, Liam and Wyatt were managing the 12 pups. The 9 kidnapped toddlers were huddled together under thick thermal survival blankets, shell-shocked but miraculously unharmed, their vital signs stabilized by Vivian's unthinkable sacrifice. In 3 separate, battery-powered transport incubators, the triplets, 2 boys and 1 girl, slept soundly, completely oblivious to the war that had raged around their birth. When the Black Hawk finally slammed onto the reinforced helipad of the Montgomery Foundation's private medical tower in downtown Denver, a trauma team of 20 specialists was waiting. They swarmed the chopper the second the skids hit the concrete, moving with terrifying precision. Silas was forced back by his own men as they rushed Vivian through the double doors of the trauma bay. For the first time in his centuries-old bloodline, the Alpha King collapsed against a sterile white wall, sliding down to the linoleum floor, his hands buried in his blood-matted hair. An hour later, the waiting room was flooded with the most powerful figures of the Montgomery pack. The parents of the 9 kidnapped pups, high-ranking diplomats, corporate executives, and fierce warriors rushed into the ward. As nurses brought the toddlers out to them, hardened, battle-scarred werewolves fell to their knees, weeping uncontrollably. Beta Gideon, his arm in a makeshift sling and his tuxedo torn to shreds, limped over to Silas. "Alpha," Gideon rasped, bowing his head deeply. "The estate is secure. I was ambushed at the southern perimeter by a secondary unit. They hit the comms tower to isolate us. I failed you. I failed the Luna." Silas looked up, his expression hollow but dangerously sharp. "You fought, Gideon. You bled. You did not fail." Silas slowly stood, his imposing 6'4" frame towering over the room. The grief in his eyes was instantly hardening into something much deadlier. Pure, calculated vengeance. "Someone let them in," Silas said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, quiet register that made the hair on the back of Gideon's neck stand up. "The Northern Coalition does not have the technology to bypass our biometric security grid. They didn't blow the vault doors. They walked through them." This was an inside job. Wyatt, the PAC's lead tactical intelligence officer, stepped into the room holding a decrypted military-grade tablet. His face was pale. "Alpha, I pulled the mainframe logs from the estate's secondary black box." Wyatt swallowed hard, his voice trembling slightly. The biometric locks on the nursery Wim A and the Luna's private suite were overridden. It wasn't a hack. It was an authorized, alpha-level clearance code. Silas's chest stopped moving. There were only 3 people in the entire world who possessed that level of clearance: Silas, Vivian, and the PAC's most trusted elder and financial architect, Councilman Frederick Caldwell. Silas whispered, the name tasting like ash on his tongue. Caldwell had been a mentor to Silas's late father. He sat on the board of the Montgomery Foundation, managing billions in human real estate assets. But Caldwell was also a staunch traditionalist who had openly protested Silas taking a low-born mate. "Where is he?" Silas demanded, the air in the room dropping 10 degrees as his killing intent manifested physically. "Flight tracking shows his private Gulfstream G650 is currently taxiing on runway 17, right at Centennial Airport," Wyatt replied, his fingers flying across the tablet screen. "He's requesting clearance for an international flight path to Zurich." Silas didn't shout. He didn't roar. He simply unbuttoned his blood-stained cuffs. "Gideon, you hold this hospital. If anyone who isn't PAC medical staff tries to enter Vivian's wing, you put a bullet between their eyes," Silas ordered, his voice echoing with absolute authority. "Liam, Wyatt, get the armored sedans. We are going to the airport." The tarmac at Centennial Airport was slick with black ice. The massive engines of the Gulfstream G650 whined, building thrust as it prepared to barrel down the runway and disappear into the night. Inside the luxurious, leather-clad cabin, Councilman Frederick Caldwell poured himself a glass of expensive bourbon. He was 60 years old, elegant, and entirely ruthless. He had sold out as Alpha. The deal with the Northern Coalition had been simple. They take the Pups and the pregnant Luna to force Silas to abdicate, installing Caldwell as the proxy ruler of the territory. In exchange, the Coalition would get the hunting grounds they desired, and Caldwell would control the Montgomery Foundation's billions. It was just business. Suddenly, the private jet violently lurched. The screech of tearing metal drowned out the engines. Caldwell was thrown to the floor, his bourbon shattering against the mahogany paneling. The jet spun wildly on the tarmac, its right landing gear completely obliterated. Outside, a matte black, armored SUV had driven straight through the perimeter fencing and rammed at high speed directly into the plane's undercarriage. Before the pilot could cut the engines, the cabin door was ripped off its hinges from the outside. Silas stepped into the cabin. He looked like a god of war, his eyes blazing, his suit ruined, his fangs fully descended. "Silas! Alpha!" Caldwell scrambled backward, dropping his human facade as his own eyes flashed yellow. "This is a misunderstanding. I was going to Switzerland to secure the PAC's emergency offshore accounts." Silas crossed the cabin in a blur of supernatural speed. He seized Caldwell by the throat, lifting the older man off the floor with one hand, choking off his words. "You gave them my mate," Silas growled, his voice a demonic double timbre of human and wolf. "You gave them our children. Our future." "She is weak," Caldwell gasped, clawing desperately at Silas's iron grip. "A low-born liability. The PAC needed pure blood. I did what was necessary for the Empire." Silas's expression remained stone cold. He dragged Caldwell out of the ruined jet and threw him violently onto the freezing tarmac. Liam and Wyatt stood by, their weapons lowered, watching the execution of PAC law. "You talk of the Empire." Silas stood over the coughing traitor. "Vivian kept 12 children alive in a blizzard, using nothing but her own life force. She possesses more strength in her broken fingernails than you have in your entire ancient, rotting bloodline." Caldwell shifted, his bones cracking as he attempted to transform into his wolf to fight, a desperate last stand. Silas didn't even bother shifting. He stomped his heavy combat boot directly onto Caldwell's knee, shattering the joint and halting the transformation with a scream of agony. "I am not going to kill you, Frederick," Silas said coldly, crouching down to look the traitor in the eye. "Death is a warrior's release. You are a corporate rat." Sheriff Brody's human police cruisers came skidding onto the tarmac, their red and blue lights painting the snow. Silas grabbed Caldwell by the collar. "I am severing your pack bond," Silas declared, a booming, magical resonance carrying the weight of the Alpha Command. Caldwell screamed as the spiritual tether to the Montgomery pack was violently ripped from his soul, leaving him a powerless, broken rogue. "And then, Sheriff Brody is going to arrest you for domestic terrorism, grand larceny, and the attempted kidnapping of 12 minors. You will rot in a human supermax prison in Florence, Colorado, under 23-hour lockdown. You will live the rest of your pathetic life in a concrete box, trapped as a human." Leaving the sobbing, ruined man in the hands of human law enforcement, Silas turned his back and walked to the waiting SUV. The adrenaline was fading, leaving only the crushing, terrifying reality of the hospital waiting for him. By the time Silas returned to Denver Memorial, 3 agonizing days had passed. Vivian had survived the surgery. Dr. Sterling had managed to repair the hemorrhaging and raise her core temperature, but the physical toll had been catastrophic. She was locked in a deep coma in the intensive care unit, hooked up to a terrifying array of monitors, ventilators, and fluid pumps. Silas sat in the sterile chair beside her bed, refusing to eat or sleep. In the adjoining room, visible through a pane of reinforced glass, the triplets lay in their incubators. Henry, the eldest, was already showing signs of a robust wolf constitution. William was quiet and observant, while little Victoria possessed her mother's delicate features. "Come back to me, Vivian," Silas whispered on the evening of the 4th day, holding her pale hand against his cheek. "The kingdom is safe. The traitor is gone. Your babies are waiting for their mother. I am waiting for my Luna." The steady, mechanical beep of the heart monitor was his only answer. Silas closed his eyes, leaning his forehead against the mattress. He pushed past the physical exhaustion, reaching deep into the metaphysical void of their mate bond. It was a dangerous technique, one that could drain his own life force, but he didn't care. He sent a pulse of pure, unadulterated love, strength, and desperate pleading across the tether, connecting their souls. "Vivian, wake up. We need you." Suddenly, the heart monitor's rhythm spiked. The steady beep accelerated into a frantic staccato. Silas's head snapped up. Vivian's fingers twitched against his jaw. A soft, agonizing groan escaped her lips, muffled by the oxygen mask. Her eyelids fluttered, fighting against the heavy sedation, before slowly, painfully peeling open. Her golden eyes, dull but undeniably conscious, met his. "Silas." Her voice was a ghost of a whisper through the mask, but to the Alpha King, it was the loudest, most beautiful symphony he had ever heard. Silas hit the call button frantically, tears streaming down his face as he leaned over her. "I'm here. I'm right here." Vivian's gaze drifted past his shoulder, fixing weakly on the glass window, separating them from the nursery. A single tear escaped the corner of her eye. "Did I?" she breathed, her brow furrowing in confusion and lingering terror. "The pups, the cold, they are perfectly fine," Silas choked out, kissing her forehead reverently. "All 12 of them, because of you. You did it, my brave, beautiful queen. You brought them all home." It took 3 grueling, agonizing weeks for Vivian Hayes Montgomery to breathe on her own, without the mechanical rhythm of the hospital ventilators. For 21 uninterrupted days, the sprawling, state-of-the-art medical wing of the Montgomery Foundation in downtown Denver was entirely locked down. It became an impenetrable fortress, guarded heavily by the most elite, battle-hardened enforcers of the pack. Silas never left her side. He conducted the brutal, sweeping restructuring of his vast empire from a sterile plastic chair pulled right up against the metal rail of her hospital bed. The Alpha King was a terrifying sight during those 3 weeks. He barely slept, his jaw covered in dark scruff, his usually immaculate suits traded for rumpled Henley shirts, his golden eyes burning with a mixture of raw exhaustion and unyielding fury. With Councilman Frederick Caldwell permanently stripped of his wolf spirit and locked away in the bleak concrete of a human supermax facility, Silas ruthlessly purged the remaining sympathizers within the pack hierarchy. Anyone on the council who had ever whispered a syllable of support for the Northern Coalition's radical bloodline purity rhetoric was immediately and permanently exiled from the territory. Silas's wrath was absolute, a cold and calculated storm that reshaped the political landscape of the North American werewolves overnight. But as Vivian slowly began to regain her color, as the bruised purple circles beneath her eyes began to fade, the Alpha's terrifying edge began to soften into a profound, overwhelming gratitude. On the morning of the 22nd day, Dr. Arthur Sterling, looking years older himself from the stress of saving his Luna, officially upgraded Vivian's condition from critical to stable. She was gently transitioned from the intensive care unit to a sprawling, heavily secured private recovery suite on the top floor. It was within those quiet, sunlit walls that the true aftermath of the nightmare on Blackwood Mountain finally unfolded. Silas sat on the edge of the plush mattress, his massive hands carefully supporting Vivian's fragile back as she held little Victoria against her chest for the first time without a tangle of IV wires between them. Henry and William were asleep in a custom double bassinet just inches away, their tiny chests rising and falling in perfect, peaceful unison. Vivian looked undeniably delicate. Her collarbones were sharp against her pale skin, and her hands trembled slightly under the weight of her newborn daughter. Yet, beneath the physical frailty, there was a new, undeniable weight to her presence. The soft, quiet pack historian from Oregon had been burned away in the freezing, bloody fires of the Rockies. In her place sat a matriarch forged in absolute survival and unthinkable sacrifice. "There are people waiting in the corridor," Silas murmured softly, brushing a stray, dark lock of hair behind Vivian's ear. He was hesitant to overwhelm her, his golden eyes scanning her pale face for any signs of fatigue or pain. "They have been standing out there since the night the transport helicopters landed, Vivian. They refused to leave the hospital grounds." Vivian looked up, her grip tightening instinctively around little Victoria's knitted pink blanket. "Who?" "Silas." "The parents," Silas replied, his voice dropping into a thick, emotion-heavy register. "The families of the 9. Vivian closed her eyes, taking a slow, deep breath. The memory of the freezing cave rushed back to her, the terrified whimpers of the toddlers, the paralyzing, bone-deep cold, and the desperate, agonizing push to keep her body radiating heat while her own organs began to shut down. Her heart rate monitor beeped a little faster, but she opened her eyes and nodded. "Let them in, Silas, please." The heavy oak doors to the suite opened with a soft click. Beta Gideon stepped inside first, his arm still wrapped in a protective brace from the estate ambush. He stood respectfully to the side, his head bowed, as a group of impeccably dressed men and women filed into the room. These were the titans of the North American Werewolf Society, the Gallaghers, the Whitmores, the Prescotts, old money, pure-blooded aristocrats who controlled multi-billion-dollar industries and vast swaths of territory. For the past 2 years, these very families had subtly mocked Vivian's lineage, whispering behind crystal champagne flutes that she lacked the dominant, ruthless blood required to rule beside Silas. Today, there was no arrogance. There was no political maneuvering. There was only raw, trembling reverence. Beatrice Gallagher, a formidable woman who managed the pack's international political relations and had been the most vocal critic of Silas's mating choice, was the first to approach the bed. Her immaculate, tailored Chanel suit was rumpled, and her usually perfectly styled hair was pulled back in a haphazard clip. Her eyes were red-rimmed, heavily swollen from days of crying. Behind her stood her mate, Thomas, holding their 2-year-old son, Oliver, one of the 9 pups Vivian had dragged through the blinding snow. To Silas's utter shock, the proud, ancient wolf did not speak a word of formal greeting. Instead, Beatrice Gallagher sank to her knees right there, on the sterile hospital floor. One by one, the other parents followed suit. Billionaires, fierce enforcers, and ruthless politicians dropped to the linoleum, bowing their heads in the deepest, most sacred gesture of absolute submission their kind possessed. It was a formal acknowledgement of a life debt, a vow of eternal loyalty that completely transcended ancient bloodlines, pack politics, and social standing. Luna, Beatrice wept, her voice breaking the heavy, electric silence of the room. She reached out with a violently trembling hand, gently touching the very hem of Vivian's white hospital blanket, as if it were a sacred relic. My Oliver, my boy, is alive, because you gave him the warmth of your own failing heart. You shielded our children with your flesh, when you were bleeding, when you were freezing. We called you weak. We were blind, arrogant fools. Beatrice looked up, tears cutting through her makeup. For as long as the Gallagher line exists, our fangs are yours. Our blood is yours. You are the true mother of this pack. Tears spilled over Vivian's eyelashes, tracking down her pale cheeks. She didn't offer them a regal, distant pardon, nor did she gloat in her vindication. Instead, she leaned forward, wincing slightly at the sharp pull of her healing abdominal muscles, and placed her hand gently over Beatrice's trembling fingers. He is Pack, Beatrice, Vivian said simply, her voice carrying a quiet, resonant power that made every wolf in the room shiver and lower their heads further. They are all my pups. Every child in this territory is mine to protect. I would do it again, 1,000 times over. Silas watched his mate, his chest aching with a love so fierce it felt like it might literally crack his ribs. He realized in that profound moment that he no longer needed to protect Vivian from the political machinations of the High Council. She had conquered them entirely, not with violence, not with intimidation, and not with alpha commands, but with the purest, most terrifying display of maternal sacrifice their ancient species had ever witnessed. 6 months later, the bitter, lethal winter had finally broken, giving way to a lush, blooming spring across the Colorado Rockies. The Montgomery Central Estate had been entirely rebuilt and fortified. The biometric security grid was now flawless, managed by a completely overhauled intelligence division led by Wyatt. But the true heart of the sprawling estate was no longer the Alpha's dimly lit war room. It was the sprawling, sunlit gardens in the southern courtyard. Silas stood on the grand stone balcony of the master suite, a crystal glass of aged bourbon in his hand, watching the vibrant scene unfolding on the manicured lawns below. Vivian was sitting on a massive, woven picnic blanket, the warm afternoon sun catching the rich golden highlights in her dark hair. She looked radiant, her strength fully returned, her laughter carrying on the crisp mountain breeze. Henry, William, and Victoria were tumbling over each other in the soft grass, robust, healthy, and incredibly strong for their age. Surrounding the triplets, acting as self-appointed, fiercely loyal sentinels, were the 9 older pups. Oliver Gallagher, now nearly 3 and displaying the early signs of a powerful wolf, was aggressively chasing a stray butterfly away from little Victoria's head, his tiny chest puffed out in protective pride. Their parents, Beatrice, Thomas, and the other high-ranking council members, watched from the shaded patio, sharing iced drinks and laughing easily. The old, toxic social divisions and bloodline prejudices had been entirely erased by the unbreakable bond forged in the ice of Blackwood Mountain. Vivian looked up toward the balcony, sensing Silas's heavy, adoring gaze. She smiled a brilliant, genuine expression that reached her bright golden eyes. She raised a hand, gesturing for the fearsome Alpha King to come down and join his family. Silas set his glass down on the stone railing. He had fought countless, bloody territorial wars, accumulated unimaginable wealth, and ruled an empire of monsters with an iron fist. But as he looked at the woman who had brought 12 children out of the frozen dark, he knew what his greatest legacy would always be. He was simply the man lucky enough to be loved by her. The tale of the Alpha King and his missing Luna became a legend whispered across generations. Vivian Montgomery proved that true strength is not measured by the sharpness of one's fangs, but by the fierce, unyielding depths of a mother's love. She was no longer the fragile girl from Oregon. She was the undisputed queen of the North American territories, the savior of 12, and Silas's fiercely beloved, eternal anchor.